welcome to Sober Dad Crew, the podcast where we talk about all things dad, sobriety, recovery, parenting, music, tattoos, and more. For more information or to get in touch, visit SoberDadCrew.com. My guest in this episode is Chris Marshall, the founder of Sands Bar, a sober establishment located in Austin, Texas. He established Sands Bar on the belief that everyone deserves a space where they are accepted and seen for who they are. Chris and I talk about a wide range of topics, but at the forefront of everything we discussed is the notion that getting sober is a political act linked to fostering community and creating a more just society. This is an important and deep conversation, and I hope you find it as meaningful as I did. Chris Marshall, welcome to Sober Dad Crew. How many kids do you have?
I have 2 kids.
And their ages?
6 and 8.
6 and 8. So I have 4 kids. My biological kids are 15 and 19, and my stepkids are 6 and 10. So I'm right there with you with that kind of younger age bracket.
Mm-hmm.
Did you always want to be a dad? Were you one of those people just always knew, or how did dadhood come about for you?
Oh, immediately. Want to be a dad. Like that was. I don't even think I knew what I wanted to be as like a career, but I knew I wanted to be a dad. That was a super important thing to me.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same way. Like my work is really about economics more than anything. But I think when I was 7 years old, like I knew like I wanted to be a dad. Like that to me is like the rock star job is being a dad.
Yeah.
When did you get sober?
February 16th, 2007. So in February, I'll have 16 years.
16 years. So definitely before your kids were born. I'll be 13 years in February. So
okay,
like
right on.
way before your kids were born. So like I had my kids as sort of part of that. And my older kid remembers more. My daughter, who's 15, doesn't really remember too much from when too much wine was being consumed in the evenings. So it's always just interesting to see where like that landed for people. Yeah. I mean, do you think that decision like led to the relationship that led to the kids?
No, this was way before then, right? Mm-hmm. Like I was 23 when I stopped drinking. So yeah. I didn't meet my wife till I was, 20, 26. So 25, 26. So it was some years after.
And, we don't need like war stories, but kind of what led to that decision to get sober?
In a sentence, it was just this profound lack of emptiness that I felt when I was drinking. I drank to feel connected to people, and I was in college and no one would be my friend anymore. No one would invite me to things. I didn't have family. I didn't have romantic relationships. My whole life had been about making connections, and alcohol was taking those things away. So as hard of a decision as it was a very easy decision to make because I was so lonely and I craved that connection so much.
Right. Was there a period of time when the alcohols at least seemed to kind of foster those relationships? And then it kind of flipped, or in retrospect, did it always kind of hinder it?
From the first moment I drank, like I was 16 when I had my first drink. I had waited because I knew alcohol was a problem. I saw other people struggle with it in my family, my dad's side. And I drank alcohol. The reason I had a beer in my hand that day was because I wanted to be like everyone else. I wanted to belong to a group of young boys who were like this group that we were kind of just like the boys. And I thought that if I had this beer, I would feel this sense of connection. And immediately I did. That first sip, I felt like we had just crossed the Rubicon. We had just done this thing that was forbidden, and we had this moment together. And I've since gone back and asked those same guys who were all my age now and parents and stuff, and like, do you remember that moment? And they have very different recollections of that. For them, it was just like, it was like hot beer had been sitting in someone's car. It was gross, but it was just like another day. Like for me, it was like this big moment of like connection with these guys. And that I think that just spoke to that sense of emptiness that I always felt. And alcohol became this. I immediately began to pair alcohol with connection and alcohol with masculinity and manhood and what it meant to be one of the boys. Like that for me was a huge thing. So I kept chasing that via alcohol because I thought that that was how you connected as a teenage boy, was to drink and get drunk.
This notion of like big alcohol is like really feeding that. So it's the masculinity thing for men, and then it's like, wine o'clock for the moms, right? There's this, it's very political and very savvy, that approach to like, this is the magic elixir. Some people will buy into the marketing and it's not a big deal, right? They just have their evening cocktail or whatever, but other people, they don't. And I think about the guy who is my best friend in elementary school. He's since, he passed away in his 40s. He never got sober. He had a sad life. And that's someone who never should have taken that first drink. Like, for whatever reason, for him and his chemistry and the part of his life, that first drink, it just kind of ruined his life. And not everybody's there. Looking back at that, I just thought, well, that's someone who, and he was one of those people who's good at everything. Music, pick it up good. Art, pick it up good. Sports, he was good at whatever he did. And it seemed effortless, but obviously there was something else like behind that, right? That was some emptiness, trauma that was behind all that.
Yeah, I mean, I that story makes me sad, but I also hear myself and so many other people in that story that had their life not been intersected by that drink, that first drink, the life that they could have had was vastly different. The trajectory of their life would have been completely different, right? There's something that is so immovable, right, and heavy about the idea of taking that first drink. Like it defines someone's life. And the later you take that drink, statistically, the better your outcomes are in life, right? Like it is a huge thing. And yeah, I just, as you were telling that story, I'm thinking about all the people in my own life who had that first drink and it sent them down a completely different path.
It's hard because you do think like, why did I get out? Someone else I interviewed said like, how come we made it and are like successful, right? We not only made it really successful in our lives, and that's one reason I'm really public about my sobriety, like in my professional environment. Like I don't hide that because I feel like it's important to share that you can do this and be successful. People in sobriety, people who are using, like their outcome can be really good, but there's a lot of stereotype around what people who have substance abuse problems look like. Walk down the streets in any city, people have this image of what that is, and the reality is really different. Yes, that is a true reality, but the broader reality is there's a lot of professionals out there who are struggling. A lot of people who are pretty highly functional, at least right now, are highly functional. They might not stay that way. So it's just always been important to me to kind of just be public and just say, look, it happened. It's part of my story. It's who I am. It informs who I am like as an employee. I think it probably in the end makes me a better employee because I'm passionate about what I do and I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Absolutely. The idea of the stereotypical person who struggles with alcohol, I think as a society, we do that to make ourselves feel more comfortable about our relationship with alcohol. Like that's the big scary thing that you want to avoid. But I'm not that. I have a job. I have a level of functionality in my life, and houselessness is not always an indicator of substance misuse or abuse. And I just find that we've always done that. We've always had this like stereotypical pariah in society, and it's just I think that's just part of the human condition. But I also know it makes sense, right? It makes sense that we would protect ourselves in that way. That sounds horrible to say, but like, as a society, we would do that.
Absolutely, I think it's true, and like self-reflection is not really a strong suit of maybe humans, but certainly Americans.
Yeah,
it's certainly like right now in the moment we live in, self-reflection is definitely not happening.
No.
And so we put up all these things that protect us or say it's the other or a lot of things like that. And it's just a challenge. Did you do a program?
Yeah. So I just did sober in 2007. So there really wasn't much except for 12 steps. I'm very, very grateful for my 12-step journey. It was, I think, if I would have stopped drinking today, I probably would have gone a different route, maybe some alternative programs. But back then, that's all there was. It was just AA. So did AA, and I did that for most of my sobriety. And now I've just learned to incorporate other things along that. Been pretty much AA my whole sober journey.
So I think a lot of people know about you from Sans Bar, but I actually was looking around at sort of the notion of sobriety and progressive political movements, and that's actually where I found you. And part of what you talked about was AA, and maybe as an African American, that system was not perfect for people who didn't fit a heterosexual white male kind of makeup. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, when I realized I needed to get sober at 23, and just to be completely honest, had I been able to maintain a life with alcohol, I totally would have. I was at a place where I could not continue living. I'm not even saying like living with some level of functionality, but like to exist. I could not exist with alcohol in my life. So I had to stop drinking. And that meant that what I was willing to accept in retrospect, I was willing to accept a lot of different things because I knew that I had to do this or not live. And that meant that I had to really contort myself and shrink myself down to like fit into the rooms of AA. And some of that was conscious. Like there were things that happened very, very early on in my 12-step journey that felt wrong, that felt like I just don't want to be in a space like this. I got sober. I've lived in Texas my whole life, born in Texas. Living in the South, you're just used to being, as a Black person, you're just used to these little slights, these death by 1,000 microaggressions. And I my whole life I had kind of lived that. And when I went to the rooms of AA, I experienced that almost immediately, being called boy, racist jokes, and the kind of hush, or objections to those jokes when people would realize that there's a Black person in the room, that kind of thing, right? Struggling to find a sponsor, people saying, I can't relate to you. I don't know your life. You're young, you're Black, you're probably going to drink again. Like all these things were just things I experienced within the first like 6 months of interacting with AA. However, I needed it. And so I was willing to accept that. Like that's the price I was going to have to pay to fit in the rooms. And I did that. And eventually, like I learned to push back on that a little, the whole like, oh, you're too young to get sober. I spilled more beer than you drank. And I was, I would just say like, well, then you were just a sloppy drunk. I learned to like push back against the kind of good old boyism that I was experiencing in some of the rooms. And that was in Houston. I moved to Austin in my first 18 months of sobriety. And that changed things. I think there's a little bit more open-minded here, but I was still told to leave. I shared about, feeling like I was not getting the jobs that I wanted because I was Black. And I just wondered, I wondered out loud. I mean, I literally just said, I just wonder sometimes, is it because I'm a Black man? I just wonder. And I was told by an old timer, that, hey, that's an outside issue, buddy. We don't bring that into the rooms. And that's when I realized I was having to leave a big part of myself out. And that was a penance I was just tired of paying.
Right. Yeah, like that's not a question I ever have to ask myself. And so that's the privilege that I have as heterosexual white man in this country. Like I don't have to ask myself these questions, or like I read Between the World and Me, which is an incredible book. And I was like, I didn't have to have these conversations with my kid on any level. And that, and that's like privilege. And people don't want to reflect on that because it makes them uncomfortable. And I'm sorry, like if that makes you uncomfortable,
Well, and I think that the word privilege is such a loaded, I think that's really where the conversation always derails, is on that word of privilege. And I always like to say, like, if privilege is a word you struggle with, think about the burden of Blackness. Like you may not have to have had that conversation or have that thought, but someone does. Black people don't. Black people have to have these thoughts or these considerations. Women have to think about how they exercise and run outside. I don't have that burden. So, maybe if the word privilege is mired in a lot of other stuff for folks, it may be easier to think about the burden a trans person has
Right.
going into a meeting and being told that they don't belong in that meeting. I don't have that. For all the things I do struggle with, I don't have to push back against folks who struggle in that way. So that's just, I always just like, because I know invariably someone's going to hear that word and they're going to feel like, privilege. What privilege do I have? It's not about your privilege. It's about someone else's burden that they have to bear.
Right. And I think that answers a lot of like when you look at the Trump movement and you look at these sort of like poor whites, right? Like, why are you possibly supporting this super rich dude in like late capitalist America? What's he doing for you? Right. Really nothing. Right. Mm-hmm. But so they'll say privilege. Like, I don't have privilege. I work in Walmart. So that notion of like, what burden does somebody else have to carry that you don't? It is a good one, and if you start talking about class, right, those folks have to carry a financial burden that I don't have to carry.
Right, and that, right? And so when you start to see it through the lens of burden, we understand that we all have burdens in this world, and I think because we live in such this late stage capitalism, right? I think it's easier for people to understand penalty and cost instead of like privilege and excess, right? Yeah. Because we still live in a world where most of us do not experience what the top 2% of this of earners in this country experience. Like we are, most of us are poor. Yeah. Like even though we're doing better than most of the world and as a developed country, we're still relatively poor. Right. So you think about penalty and burden; those are things we all understand. We all understand late fees, right? And that's all I'm saying is that being Black has afforded me these late fees that I don't think are fair, and I have to pay them whether I want to or not. I have to pay them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I worked at a credit union for a while, and it was at a time when it was recently in that conversation about literal late fees, right? That like late fees are literally a poor tax. Yeah. Because if you're rich, you don't ever overdraw your account, right? No. Like that doesn't even ever happen. So that's like a great analogy, I think, for further the conversation. Because one of the things I've been seeing, and I live in like pretty rural upstate New York now since I moved in with my fiance, and it's like a pretty, relatively conservative community. So when I'm out there at Saturday soccer, I'm not necessarily seeing a lot of folks that might politically align with my democratic socialist tendencies. Yeah. But I need to talk to them, right? Because like one of the great losses is we're siloed and nobody talks. And if they do talk, it's not in any way polite, right? So most people are probably love their kids, right? So there's a lot of things we do have in common, but we're just my 19-year-old son, he's like, America's balkanized. He's like young and passionate, and he'll just say, he's like, look, it is a balkanized nation, says the passionate, young adult, but he's also right. And so how do we overcome that? I mean,
this is a lot. I did not expect to have this conversation, but I love that we're having it because I never get to talk like this. And so one thing that I've always, and as a business person, you're always mindful of like what you're saying and try to be as big tent and compassionate as possible. And so I'm very kind of like close to the vest about my personal politics. But I will say this. I will say that I have hope that one day we will start to think of the other as people who just need to have some different education or different understanding. And the question I always have for people is, what room and grace are you providing for someone to realize that they were wrong? I feel like what happens to a lot of people politically and almost with substances as well, it's like we're so siloed, and the more you push people to an extreme, there's no room for them to come back, because to acknowledge that they were wrong. And I think that's what happened with a lot of things, especially with Trump. It's like people were like, okay, I got on this ride I don't really want to be on anymore, but the penalty for getting off, right? There was no room for you to say, you know what, I was
My
wrong.
bad.
I got it wrong. Yeah, there was no room, and so
Yeah.
it just, the further it moved, it's like, well, I guess I'm on this. I guess I guess I believe this now, and I just see that there's just no room, and in both ways. Like I just see there's no room for anyone to say, you know what, maybe we need to offer grace for people, because I'm just like, I'm imagining what's going to happen to people when they say I was wrong. What's going to happen when Aunt Judy on Facebook realizes that what's happening isn't right, and wants to get off of this ride? Is there a room? I don't think, as things exist now, there is. And so, and I
So
just
they're going
think
to stay on the train.
they're going to stay on the train
Yeah.
as it runs off the tracks, as it goes over the cliff. They're stuck, and I think the only way to get them unstuck is to say, like, it's okay to get off the train. Like you can get off, and you'll be met with grace and compassion.
Right. Yeah. And we've lost so much grace and compassion. In some ways, did we have as much as I thought we did in my
Yeah.
sort of probably not. And because there's that, oh, this was always there. It just is way out in the open
Mhm.
in a way that, I mean, at least it's easy for me to sort of live this life of the true believer. When Obama was elected, like, oh, look what we did. But for others, who are not part of the sort of overarching, white supremacist part, call it what it is, you've always seen it. It's always been there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always been there. And I think social media has just provided this tinder for this fire. I think when I was a boy, I wanted to be a dad, but then also wanted to be a journalist. Those are two things I knew, because I love telling stories. I loved hearing stories. That's what I did as a counselor. I loved hearing people's stories, especially stories that I would have never heard otherwise. I thought that journalism was this wonderful vehicle to, like, the access of stories that from people. And I think one thing that has changed so much, besides Citizens United, money and politics, is the fact that the idea of just news and facts has just changed. I think when everyone started to have their opinion under news, it changed what was the idea of reality. It changed what was true. And we can't all agree on a set of facts. And I think that just makes it really hard too.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, like, growing up, Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather,
Yeah.
that was the news. So we might, whatever, homelessness is a fact, right? Everyone would agree it's a fact. How we would view it or seek solutions are different, but we wouldn't disagree on the reality of the
Right.
issue. And that's right. Like, really, right now, people are, like, just being told and acting that certain things just aren't true, that facts aren't facts, that science isn't science. And how do you even, and it goes back a little bit to your point of, like, how do we welcome those folks back in? How do you bring those folks back to the table is a really important question, because those of us who view ourselves as progressives, or sort of whatever term you want to put on it, we can't be the excluders, right? We have to open doors for people to come back in and listen and understand. I mean, because I think people want to be heard, right? More than anything, people want to be heard, and they yell when they aren't heard. Because 100% in this country, if you have a minimum wage job or an hourly job, it's rough, right? And healthcare is bad, and so it is rough out there for a lot of people. And when they get these sort of skewed facts, they buy into them. A lot of what Trump did was not new. The kind of race card and the pitting, poor whites against BIPOC folk, that is not new at all, right? It's
a tale as old as time.
It is the history of America right there. But how do you, bring people together and actually sort of let people be heard, and actually try and bring people back to facts and reality, that those people are not your enemy. The great wealthy people who got richer and richer and richer during the pandemic. Some people cleaned up.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, it was
100%.
a windfall. It was a
Yeah.
windfall for so many people. Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's just one of those things. And it's funny, I was sort of thinking about that notion of, when Marx talked about religion as the opiate of the masses. I also think alcohol and drugs are literally the opiates of the masses. And it goes back to that big alcohol, but it really does kind of, to me, connect to this bigger political issue is like 100% keeping people medicated is good for the system. And that's not even touching on like the prison industrial system, which is way, way, way more filled with people of color.
Yeah.
And it's been that way.
I think if America had an addiction, it is the addiction to otherism. I think that's how, I mean, literally, it's how the colonies were founded. Like, look, we're different and divergent from what's happening here. We're going where we can be ourselves and live our own truth. There's people who live here. They're others. Like they're others. So let's other them and let's exterminate them, which is what happened.
Literally, right? They othered them with smallpox. That's real.
Guns, gold, steel. Yeah, I mean, it's what happened. Germs. I think it's germs, guns. That's what happened here, and that didn't change. When Asian folks came here to this country, excluding was in otherism, and then just the idea that if you were different, you were lower class, and there was always room for exploitation. There was always room for building ourselves up on the backs of the other, and the goal was to move from other to the majority. That's always been the goal here. Like you got to move away, and while it is race, it's also religion. It's also socioeconomics. It mostly is, money, right? It's like, how can we move away? And even in subgroups, right? Like how can poor Black folks be separated from wealthier and more affluent Black folks? That exists. The colorism. How can darker skinned Black folks move away, or how can lighter skinned Black folks move themselves away from the darker skinned Black folks? It is always about otherism, and it's just this ball that's just been rolling and gaining in momentum since the founding of this country. And I think that I don't know. I still have hope that one day we will just get off of that ride. We will just stop using otherism to propel our politics and our economics.
Yeah, I am an optimist, and I do think the arc of the universe, it does bend towards justice. It's just real slow. I was talking to my oldest son about this lately, because the little community I live in, for the first time in 20 years, the boys varsity soccer team is like making this run for the state championship. But a chunk of people on that team are Latinx kids of, people who had been migrant farm workers in this community and never been included. Like my fiance who grew up here, she said, when I was a kid, those kids weren't on the sports team. But they're core of that team. It might not impact their parents, but it's going to impact those kids. And I was thinking, I'm not going to remember the book. It was I grew up in Maine, and there are a lot of African immigrants in Portland, Maine for a while. They kind of moved out, and it was this logging town, and there was a lot of strife. And the soccer team coach came to that first practice, and like the town kids were here, the immigrant kids were here, and he said every other person.
Wow.
And that team went to the state championship, and like 7,000 people showed up. I mean, it's like a Class D school, it's a tiny school, like 7,000 people showed up for the game. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Right. And so there are those moments where it's like, we did swing, and now we're swinging back, and we're going to, that is also American history.
Yeah.
As the pendulum goes, and I guess I have to believe it moves ever so slowly in a direction that's better. I mean, like the way my kids, view issues of gender diversity are so different than my generation.
Oh yeah.
Like they literally are like, whatever. I mean, like, they're, kids who grew up in a progressive house, but they're like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
It's all good.
Yeah. And you know what, while that is the home, right? And then that's, same over here. Like in our home, like this is what my kids just believe because this is what we believe. It's also what they're seeing in media. Like I just before this call, they're just watching something on Disney Channel and just talking about it's okay to be you and be however you want to be and love who you need to love in this world. Like that is something I would have never seen growing up in the 90s. I would have never heard that. So it's so cool to see. And I agree. Like it is a micro shift every swing of the pendulum, but it does move towards inclusion. It does move, and I just believe that. And I believe that humans are going to always have. That's just a human condition. I think suffering is part of the human condition. We're never going to eradicate that, but I do think that there is something so hopeful about my children and watching my children, the way that they relate to each other, the way that I see my peers parent their kids, and how active of, I'm not the only dad in my group of friends who cooks dinner and is a stay-at-home dad and like does the things and picks up the kids. It's always changed diapers. It's not a big deal when my wife wants to go out to dinner with their friends. Like
Right.
that used to be like a sitcom, situation
Yeah.
where the dad's by himself. Like, how's he gonna manage? I'm like, that's just a Tuesday. Like, I know
Yeah.
how to do it.
I mean, I remember because I was a single dad for a lot of years,
Mm.
and I remember it's like a Friday, and I was like buying frozen pizza. I was just so tired. It was all week, and this little old lady was like, "Oh, isn't it like cute? Like mom must be out.
Mm.
Dad's just getting some frozen pizza because he's not capable. Like I make all our bread in my house. Like, come on, I'm
Yeah.
a good cook. Like I
Yeah.
can cook, but I am tired after hustling this week with two little kids, and I'm a single dad.
Mm.
And when my son, who's 19, I stayed home with him for a year, and it was the same thing. Like, oh, dad must be babysitting. I'm like, no, like I am the
No.
primary caregiver here. If I was
Right.
a single parent, it's just me,
Yeah.
and I have a awesome relationship with their mom. I mean, we're all like gonna have crazy big family Thanksgiving at my
Beautiful.
house.
Yeah.
Everybody's gonna be there. That's what we do. We call it's the crowded table, and we just bring them all. But I was like, thought about that little old lady. It's like, no, lady, I'm not. I'm just so tired that I just want to go home and throw these in the oven and like
Yeah.
watch a movie with my kids and chill. I'm not the babysitter.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
also still a thing with dads, right? There is still a lot of like inequity in partnerships, and I try and be really aware of that in my relationship, making sure it's fair. And I mean, I do a lot of cooking because I like to do it too. So that's a win for me, that it's
Yeah.
relaxing to do it. But
No, I hear
um,
you. I think that it is there's still a ways to go, especially just the idea of like men being nurturers and being primary caregivers. It was my idea to be a foster parent. Like I wanted to be a foster parent. I wanted to adopt my children. I'm
yeah,
sorry, I don't think I said that, but my children are adopted.
okay,
Yeah, sorry. Just they're my kids. Like you
yeah,
asked me how many
right. Well,
kids.
my stepkids, I don't call my stepkid; they are my kids, right? And
Right,
actually,
right,
my kids' mom, we were foster parents many
yeah,
moons
right
ago,
on.
and that was a great. I mean, it was hard, right? Like
Oh yeah.
it's a hard thing because it's a broken system, right? I
Oh my
mean,
gosh,
you're there trying to like really pick up pieces of stuff that's just real hard.
absolutely.
But it was also ultimately made me a better parent going forward, and I don't regret that at all. But right, like my kids are my kids. Like I have four kids, whether or not
Yeah.
two are biologically mine, and my older brother's actually adopted. So that's also like in my life something I just grew up understanding.
Hmm.
But it just is the reality. Is like I love them all.
Yeah.
They are my kids. It's a wide age range now, but it's interesting to kind of circle back with the perspective of, all right, I've sort of seen like that really investment early on, those early
Hmm.
years.
Hmm.
Like sort of before they're teenagers, just like super attentiveness, really like nurturing. Like, so when they're like 15 or 16, if you haven't done that work, they're not going to really share with you. You have to
Hmm.
invest that, it's an investment in the future with your kids for that relationship? Because like and I'm sure there's still stuff my older kids don't tell me, but
Sure.
you know, we have a really open relationship and we like work hard at it. And like, you know, I learned also to like apologize. Like as a parent, I'm like, I'm really sorry. I was really tired and I kind of lost my cool. I'm like, if I'm expecting you to apologize, I'm going to apologize when I'm wrong too.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that that's not always what is seen there. And to sort of tie it back in, it is connected to that like masculinity thing. Men are supposed to be tough and they're supposed to be this and they're that. And that does like tie into that, like having a beer and like doing that thing with your guys and all that. And it's just, you know, just to tie that thread up a little bit.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think it's all related. I mean, I think the through line is, you know, what we've been talking about the entire conversation is like seeing yourself as part of a whole, right? Like seeing yourself as part of this larger system. We talking about politics, talking about recovery. We've been talking all these different things. And I think it's like, how do you see yourself existing within the system? And of oneself, there is little I can do to change the entire world. I really have no power to change the entire world, but I do have the power to change the small system that I'm in. I have the power to change the way that I talk to my kids, the way that I shepherd them into the next phase of their life. I have power over how I show up in my local politics, you know, voting at the local levels, running for office, if that's something I feel called to do. I have the power to speak out in a larger sense in my city when there's injustice done to LGBTQ folks, or when the right for women to choose has been taken away nationally, but especially here in Texas.
Yeah.
I have that power. And so if I recognize that power and I step into that power, and if enough of us do that, right? If 300 million people individually decide that they're going to step into their power as parents, as workers, as community members, as members of a larger society, then the entire country shifts ever so slightly.
Yeah, and I feel like that as someone who, like, you know, to sort of pick up on our earlier conversation, as someone who generally speaking carries a lighter burden, I also feel like it's really is my job to speak up. In a lot of ways, it's easier publicly, it's harder at work, but I try and nudge that needle at work. I am direct marketing and business development and architecture firm, but an example of that is we proposed on this daycare center in Syracuse. And it's the part of Syracuse where the highway was run through. Another classic American story. But the highway's coming down. And we were sort of building this team. And I said, you know, like, and I was talking to my fiance who's a social worker, and I was like, what do we need? We don't just need like architects and engineers. And we actually added a social worker to our team as the person who would hold our feet to the fire, really, to make sure like we were listening to the community, that we weren't building this for you, we were building this with you. And you know, and I like to think no one else was like thinking about that, but I was like, that, you know, you got to try and nudge that needle where you can. And right. It's an incredible place to work. It's so employee centered, but making sure also in the work we do, and we do a lot of affordable housing work, so it's relevant in that, is that we have to like work with these communities that we're doing this for. Otherwise, it's just really not a community focused project. I do want to like touch on your business, because I think that's like a cool part of this whole thing, and does connect to the notion of like community and not feeling isolated in this world. So can you know, tell me about your business a little bit and how it came about?
Well, yeah, so I am the owner of Sands Bar, an alcohol-free bar based here in Austin. I started that in 2017 because I was a counselor and working with folks, kind of like you were talking about, building community and social work. I was working with the local folks here in treatment, you know, all levels from residential to outpatient. And I recognized that folks needed a place to go that was not a clinical environment, but still help to develop the skills of socializing and most importantly, listening. I just really created Sandspar with this belief that as a society, we've lost the ability to listen to each other. So much of our social media is just talking out to the world. It's a one direction apparatus. Like everything is about your opinion, your view, how you think, how you feel, what you're wearing today. And there's not enough listening. And so I wanted to create a place where people could really listen to each other and connect. And I believe that the best version of anyone is alcohol free. And the best version to make connections with other human beings is alcohol free. So Sandspar exists as an alcohol free space, not because I'm against alcohol, but I'm pro connection. I'm pro bridging the gap. I'm pro, society coming together. So it is by virtue alcohol free.
And that it's funny because I had that notion of a place like this near Ithaca, New York, and then I was like, it's too small here. It's a very small city. So I thought, yeah, that would be amazing. And that probably exists in bigger places, which is too bad. But right, there is a real, the economics. And for me, as like a music guy, I was like, oh, I'd like to do shows, but the economics of that are pretty rough if you're not slinging beers.
It used to be. And I think that is true. And I probably got started with Sandspar about a year or two too early, in fact, because there weren't a lot of non-alcoholic beers, wines, or spirits. But that all changed in 2018, 2019, when there was just a boom of non-alc. And it is still non-alc is still the fastest growing segment of the beverage market for like 3 years running. And all the forecasts, even given the downturn we're just headed for inevitably, right?
Yeah.
It's
we
still
keep pretending we're not, but
yeah. Oh yeah. It's again, let's just what fire? What let's press on the gas a little harder just to see what's gonna happen. You're like, nah, it's gonna happen. The good thing is we already have the pandemic as evidence that when things get tight, people decide not to drink, and people are looking for those options, and they're excited about them, right? Even for COVID, it was a bit different. People were able to experiment at home, and so thus were sales. A lot of sales were e-com. People just like, hey, I don't know what this is, but I'm just going to order a bottle of alcohol-free whiskey to see what happens. And now that people are obviously coming out and doing more things socially, there still is a lot of interest in bottle shops, in bars. And so we're seeing a rapid growth. And so one thing, in addition to Sandspar, I also have this academy called Sandspar Academy. And that is where I take 10-week course where I take people through all the building blocks of just starting their own bottle shop, bar, or even like their own kind of sober, alcohol-free influencer kind of thing. And so I've been doing that since the pandemic for 2 years now. It's been a really cool thing. In fact, how far are you from Rochester?
Couple hours, not even 90 minutes.
If you ever find yourself in Rochester, there's Alt Bar.
Okay.
And two of my students have like this pop-up bar in Rochester that they're doing that's alcohol-free. It's called Alt Bar.
All right. No, I'll definitely check it out. And there's even in Ithaca, there's this place, Watershed, and they do sober Sundays.
Nice.
Which is great. But they always have, I drink a lot, my house is like coffee and seltzer. So I do like the notion, if I'm going out with folks, even if they're like, I have friends that drink, it really doesn't bother me. They know where I stand. And, in the before the pandemic, we'd go out for trivia or whatever, but it is nice to feel like you're getting something kind of like fancy, right?
Yeah.
Or because I love food, and and I actually worked in the wine industry for a while, and I did miss that notion of a good meal connected with a really nice beverage that does these things like cleanse your palate, enhances the meal. And so having those options out there is really nice, because there's some like incredible stuff out there that's just delicious. And then you get to drive home and you don't worry about it and you feel good the next day. And it's, that's a super cool thing. And if I ever get to Austin, I'll definitely go. I'm not sure
absolutely.
Happen,
absolutely.
But,
I'm all over. I do it in addition to the the bar and the school, virtual school. I also do this tour. I tour around the country, so I'll be in 17 different markets next year.
Oh, cool.
I think the closest I'll be to you is going to be New York, NYC, or Toronto. I'll be in Toronto.
Yeah, they're about equidistant from here, which is actually pretty great to be equidistant.
Yeah,
from
that's pretty
those
cool.
two
That's pretty
cities,
cool.
right?
Yeah, but yeah, so I go around the country in Canada, hosting these one night events where I show people what's possible. And I think you're right. It's about having options. It's not saying that you have to drink these things, because for some people, coffee and seltzer is all they want. They're not really interested in more, and that's fine. But what I am so excited about are all these things, to your point, which do add to the meal and to the ritual of socializing, that are just really innovative. There's a lot of botanical stuff that is just, alcohol or not, it's next level. Like, people are just like, what is this? And I have the great fortune of bartending for a lot of events that serve alcohol. I was at an event this week that I catered. There's a bar that served alcohol, bar that didn't serve alcohol. And my bar was busier because people were just blown away. Like, what is this? Like, these things that they had never seen before. They were just blown away by it. So yeah, I think there's a lot more excitement. Like, you can have a rum and Coke like you always do, or a gin and Sprite, or you can have this really elevated thing with like sage and like interesting botanical on top of that. There's a lot of different things you can do, and the drinks will never get you intoxicated. They're only there to elevate the experience.
Right. And I think there's a real like generational quality to that too. I think like my son's generation as like a young adult, they seem less, at least in his circle, less interested in alcohol. I think there's other natural things that other which is not my thing, but like,
sure.
Each to their own a little bit, and just don't drive. Part of my vibe, like I really, in a lot of ways, people can make choices as long as they don't impact other people. But I think this younger generation is sort of less interested in alcohol. He's not going the traditional college route, so I can't sort of speak to what that experiences. It seems like that is still a world that is pretty focused on that, but I don't know. I mean,
it's shifting.
It's
shifting. It really is shifting. I work with the University of Texas we've created this program called the Shift Makers, SHIFT, Shift Makers. It's not an acronym. It's just an intention to shift the culture on college campuses. And so I find myself at, almost 40 years old on a college campus more than I ever thought.
That makes you feel that stuff.
Yeah. It's like, goodness gracious. And I hear what you're saying about your son, that this generation, first of all, grew up in a post 9/11 world, grew up in a world where there was like a financial crash. They grew up in this world where and then they didn't get to have like their last couple of years of high school because of COVID. So they're just like, oh, you're supposed to just come to college and just get drunk. I don't get that. Like, they literally have no frame of reference of like, this is the old world that my parents grew up in. And their parents, I've heard this, like their parents will push, hey, this is your time. These are the years. These are your wonder years. You go out there and you get wasted. And they're just like, but why? Why would I do that? I didn't do that in high school. Why would I go to college and do that? Have you seen financial debt that comes from your student loans? Like,
yeah,
these kids they're built different. They're just built differently.
And I see that with my son, and he did this semester abroad in Costa Rica, which I think was really great. And it was hard for him at first too, because they landed and they had to isolate because it was COVID. Because he was there, I guess, like last fall, he would have been there, and it was hard. And he was away from home. His mom has a 3-year-old sister, like a 3-year-old daughter that's his little sister. So there's a lot of stuff that was hard with that. But I applaud sort of his bravery to come back and say, I don't think I'm interested in college. I think there's another way for me. It's actually the harder way and the braver way. So I really applaud that. And I also was like, woo, that, like, staring at that expense of college is just bonkers. And my 15-year-old, she's interested in nursing. So I'm like, oh, well, you'll be totally solid. That's a hard job, but you can get paid really well as a nurse. And that's really career oriented. But it is like this different shift of like, how can I be of service?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just so important.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's this idea that we are already in an environmental crisis. Like there's like we've reached a point of no return on that. And it's like, okay, I still think that this is the greatest generation, or we're gonna see the greatest generation. Like, maybe even my kids at 6 and 8, like maybe they are going to be the greatest generation because they're going to have to solve a lot of problems that we just again kept hitting the snooze button on, like, oh, we'll fix it, and now it's like, no, what is it, like 1,000,002 you need to retire now, the
Yeah.
idea, of a system that my mother and even my grandfather, of course, like the life that they have in mind for themselves and their children are vastly different than the one I have for mine. I can't imagine my children retiring. I can't imagine my children living in this on this planet, like in a way that's not, filled with like environmental hazards. I know that their life's going to be different. And I think they're going to be the ones that they're waiting for. They're going to make the change, and they're going to figure this out, because humans, we figure it out. But it just takes a generation to do that.
And I think they're also going to have to come together, right? There is no, in my mind, way that that works if all these different like communities haven't come together for the solution. And
Yeah.
on every level, like nations coming together, like one nation can't pollute, right? Well, another doesn't, or like the gas consumption in America compared to other countries is just sort of bonkers. And I say that as somebody who drives 40 minutes to work as one person in my car
Yeah.
every day,
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm that guy in my like Mazda SUV, like driving alone to work,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, oh God.
There's
Turn up
that
the
thing again
music and I'll
about
feel
one,
better about it.
right. There's that idea about that one person having no power, but having all the power. And my environmentalist friends will say, like, well, it's not us, it's big coal. It's like this, all these industries. Like, yeah, yeah, yeah. You know what? But I also have my part too to play. And like I have to be mindful of that as well.
Yeah.
And imagine that while I have the privilege of that, the burden is the environment. The earth must bear the burden that I don't have to think about. And that's just proof that there's always a burden that we all bear. I think any living being bears a burden. That's life. And so, yeah, it's exciting to watch my kids, and I'm really trying to foster this idea of making your own path. I think that is really important, and that was something that my mom did for me. Like of course, I mean, she wanted me to go to college. I mean, that was college was never a question. College was never like there's another option. I was going to go to college or the military. Actually, I tried to do both, but my drinking got in the way of the military thing, which I'm not. Now that I understand what PTSD is, I'm so grateful.
And given your age and the time, it's probably
Oh,
100% a good time to have
oh
not
my
been in the
gosh. Oh,
military.
you have no idea. So
Like,
I graduated high school in 2002. That was in the heat of the Iraq War, and went to become a reservist, and was about to go to basic, and thankfully my alcohol caught up to me, and my alcohol use caught up to me, and my recruiter was like, I think you probably need to stop this process before you go to basic, because once you're in, you're going to get dishonorably discharged. It's not going to be the thing. Like he's like we need folks,
yeah,
but
right. It's bad when the military
yeah,
tells
it's
you,
like we need folks, but
not
the
you.
worst thing, he's like, I care about. And oh, great guy, Sergeant Stoneham. Oh, I don't even know what happened to that guy, but was an angel, because he was like, if because there's a long process before we actually like sign on the dotted line and go to basic and go to AIT. He's like, if you get into the military and you go over there and you can't hold it together, you're going to get dishonorably discharged. And that's going to impact your life just in a way that you don't want it to. And he's like, I would suggest that you just go get the help that you need. And I didn't go get the help that I needed immediately, but that set me on the path of realizing like my life is really in shambles. Like I can't even join the military. During the Iraq War, I was, supposed to join a medic unit that was going to go, get deployed over there. And I didn't, because I couldn't stay sober. Again, grateful for it, because I don't think I was already struggling with some stuff. I don't think being in the military would have helped that. And I also conversely have profound respect for folks who do go to the military, who do serve this country. I absolutely do. You know, there's an amazing, I know that as a system, it's not perfect, but the folks who have signed on that dotted line, who have gone on to war, and even not seen combat, but just gone to serve this country, like I have a profound respect for those folks. And that's one of those things that being on this side of the aisle, you may not expect people to say, like, oh, you don't expect there to be a profound respect for folks in the military. I do. I have a profound respect for folks.
And I think that's another like false division that's created. And there's stories that, came out of folks returning from Vietnam and all that. Certainly touches on what is a complicated conversation about how to reform policing because it's not working, right? And the solutions are not easy, but to say you like want reform is not to say it, at least on like some basic level, that you have some respect for it. I mean, I lived in Chicago and worked with gang kids in Chicago, and we had a program called Street Law, and we taught kids how to get Mirandized and stuff. And I literally did have a Chicago police officer say to me, the only thing you need to tell the kids is don't run, because if they run, we'll beat them up.
Wow.
So I was like, okay, we need to get from that place. Yeah. Hey, it was honest. Yeah. But and it was Chicago, so it was 100% true. But how do we get for people who are like, yeah, I don't like what the military is doing, but it doesn't mean I can't respect people who've chosen to serve.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and it is complicated because I don't want to, see people come back with PTSD. I'd rather they don't have to go to war. But how do we like foster these conversations in a way that is productive? There's listening and understanding. It's all like what we've been talking about. Like, how do you find the place where people can come together, find common ground, and seek like solutions?
And I think that's, to a degree, that's where the otherism is so unhealthy, and it really is a detriment to our development as a society. Is that when you other everyone, you put them in this large group and you make everyone the worst version of the other. I work out at Planet Fitness occasionally. I don't work as much as I need to, probably, but I was like, I love about going to work out at Planet Fitness is they have all the screens, right?
I used to go there. Yep.
And they have like Fox News and CNN, and I love watching these like parallel universes, right? And what both screens did was they make each the other the worst version of the other, like the worst version. And the truth is that most people on either of those boxes and either of those screens are not those polar extremes. They're probably somewhere in the middle. And I think that part of the solution is to like untether everyone from the other, to look at individuals. And when individuals talk, I have a friend who's I'm not ashamed to say this. I have a friend who's a Trump supporter and a very, very ardent COVID questioner, not denier, but a questioner for sure. And we maintain a relationship in part because I recognize the humanity, and I also understand that what we have in common is so much more than what we have. And we talk about politics and we disagree ferociously. We disagree. Yeah. But I've always made space in my heart. Yeah, and it is in my heart. I've always made space in my heart for that conversation to shift. And there's been cracks in that armor where it's been like, do you really think that all people that come to this country are looking to like take advantage of this? Or do you think that everyone deserves a chance at like having a safe place to like lay their head at night? Well, I mean, of course, everyone deserves that. Well, imagine that. Imagine you were just crossing an invisible border into this great state of Texas to find a better place for your kids to sleep. That's okay. Like, we should be okay with that. And this,
right. It's an honor to be that place, right? I mean, that's a lens to put on that. Doesn't that make America great, to kind of play on that, tired red baseball hatted thing? But isn't isn't that we're viewed as the safe place in the world, like a compliment as a country? Isn't our messy democracy, like, democracy's messy? I mean, it just is, but it's the best mess.
Yeah.
Right.
I wouldn't want another mess. Like, this is
it's like,
you know.
Yeah, I mean, it is messy, and I guess it should be, right? We should wrestle with big issues. You have that friend, and you've kept that friendship. A lot of people, like, how many unfriending on Facebooks, which is sort of performative. You know, I have family that are ranchers in Wyoming, and we definitely have some different perspectives.
Right.
You know, on the world, and which is also, like, okay. It's just when, like, around choice or gun control, though most Americans actually are in favor of some level of all those things, right? Most Americans actually want some level of gun safety.
Yeah.
Right. And I have friends that hunt, like, 100%. And most people want some level of access to abortion. You know, there's spectrums of that, but the majority of those people want that. But our political system being what it is, and how it takes generally speaking, like, AOC is kind of an exception to this, how it generally takes wealth to get elected.
Right.
How do you so we have a bunch of people who are, like, largely old white dudes, real old white dudes, I think, even voting for stuff they don't believe in because it keeps them in power and it keeps them wealthy.
Or stuff that has no direct impact on you. I think that's a very interesting thing that you can have. It changes your life not at all to, like, make a decision, and that decision impacts millions of people. That just, I don't think that's what the founders had in mind originally. I don't think that they thought that, you know, again, founders had a lot of problems, but I don't think that they originally wrote that document thinking this was going to be about the consolidation of just our power. The idea was, like, we're going to get away from this idea of, like, the consolidation of power at the top. We're going to make a representative, you know, system where everyone has a chance to speak up. Obviously, that's flawed. Obviously, that was idealistic. Obviously, it was rooted in white supremacy and other things, right? But I do think that the intention of the founders was that we have this ability to say and shift the way that things are. I think that one thing that I've always wanted to say was just, like, make America, like, not make, like, the whole great again. You can leave that part, but to make America, I think it's within all of us, and it's with incumbent upon all of us to make America. We still can make America. It's not a finished product. It is not a cake that's already baked that you can't unbake. Like, it is still forming. It's still in its infancy.
There's a Bruce Springsteen and Obama did this podcast.
Oh yeah,
Renegades. I don't know if you listened to that, but
I've never listened to
about the gap between the American dream and the American reality.
Ooh.
And it's what you're saying. It's how do we close the gap? That's what making America is closing the gap between the American dream and the American reality.
That's beautiful.
And I was like, that was deep. And I was like, that's right. And we're all sitting in this gap. And we all have our own different lens on that, where we land depending on our experiences and our backgrounds and all that. But it is like, how do we, like, narrow the gap for the most people? Like, not everybody has to be rich. Nobody has to be filthy rich. But, like, you know, how do we make sure no one's having to go to the food pantry? That shouldn't be a thing in America.
Yeah. If we could just remove the otherism, then there's no idea that someone that has to be someone. I think that's a big part of the problem, is that there has to be someone who suffers, because without that, what would we be? And I think that as much as white supremacists talk about white supremacy and how, like, or, you know, these people will not replace us or all these other things, I always wanted to ask white supremacists, like, so what happens when you get what you want?
Yeah, what who's going to work the crappy jobs?
Right, like what happens when it's just you? Who becomes the other?
Yeah,
like, who becomes the other in your perfect world? Like,
in upstate New York, who's picking the apples and who's picking the grapes?
Right. Yeah,
because clearly nobody wants to do that.
Right. And that is, like, these are problems that otherism, and it's like, those are things, like, when you are so siloed, you have no, and that's what the whole unfriending. That's that we got kind of turned on an alley there, but
Yeah.
we're talking about the unfriending thing. Like the unfriending thing did more harm than people realize. Like the unfriending thing changed the way that you saw the world because you were no longer seeing those two screens. Like I was talking about the gym. That was my point. Yeah, at the gym, you're seeing these two screens, and if you have no understanding of what the other screen is doing and how that reality is existing for them, then when that moment does come, right? Like when things change for that person, when they have that realization that maybe this isn't the way I didn't want to live anymore, you have no basis for understanding them. You have no language to understand what they've been experiencing for the past 5 years, right? Like if you don't understand QAnon, you don't understand the rabbit hole and the pipeline from wellness and yoga to Trumpism. Like if you don't have an understanding of how that exists, which it does, and a lot of people I know who started off as yogis and yoga practitioners ended up, very on the other end of where they started. If you don't have the language and understanding of that, it's going to be very hard to deprogram someone when they do realize. Like, and I often think about Nazi Germany and after Hitler fell, like what did it take for average citizens to shove off Nazism? Like what did it take? Because that's the evidence that we have, right? That this possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think South Africa provides an interesting model, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, Desmond Tutu, incredible human being, but people had to let go on both sides, right? Because some hard things, some bad things happen in both directions.
Yeah.
But like they seem to, it's certainly not perfect there, but that was an interesting process that I've read a lot about and think, how do we, because that was a path forward, right? Like that's a model of a path that actually brings people who did storm the Capitol on January 6th. That's actually, and you talk about that, like what's the mechanism? That's an interesting model. And a whole country adopted it. It's like really pretty incredible thing. Wave my wand and we'll have ours. I mean, maybe that's really what the January 6th, committee should be doing. Instead of, I mean, people should be, prosecuted.
Right.
But, instead of maybe just totally gathering evidence, maybe if there's ever a part 2 of that, it's like now our job is to the one police officer, guy with the beard and tattoos, who was like a really conservative guy before that, and then was like begging for his life. How do you get him in a room telling his story and someone on the other side telling their story, but the goal is to find the way forward?
Right. I think that when you said that, I just thought about the 9/11 Commission, right? And like how the underlying investigate or the one outcome of the 9/11 Commission was to realize that we had a failure of imagination. Like that's the only thing I remember reading a lot of stuff. I was, listening to articles on NPR and stuff, but that's the one line I remember. The one line I remember is that we had a failure of imagination. We could have never conceived that this was possible. And I think that there needs to be a similar outcome of January 6th. Like what is the thing that we missed, right? And the thing that, and how do we move forward? How do we make sure that this never happens again? We're still taking off our shoes 20 years after 9/11. Something that happened and something changed forever, right? And I think that until that happens with race and otherism, we're just going to keep doing it. We're just going to keep repeating the same story over and over again. But
all right, I'm going to give you the last word on that because I think that was great. And it's getting later, and you're going to making dinner and all that. I mean, we could probably talk till midnight.
I just goodness gracious.
It was really incredible, and I really appreciate your time.
Likewise, it was great. All right, take care.
Yeah, take care. Thanks for listening. For more information, for links to any music or books we talked about, or to buy some Sober Dad Crew merchandise, please visit SoberDadCrew.com.